Yeah. So music was a fundamental part of medieval and early modern life in Europe, and as a result, references to paintings appear repeatedly in many works of art. In fact, once we start looking, we find that paintings are positively teeming with references to musical instruments. Can you see? You'll have to sort of screw your eyes up, but if you look closely at these paintings, I don't have a mouse, so I'll just have to, there on this side, this painting by the Italian painter, you see all the angels, then the one in the middle, every angel holds a musical instrument.
Could you do something about the volume?
Oh, sorry, you can't hear me. Is it not on? Do you think it's not on?
No, I think it should be.
I'll try and talk louder.
Please, yes.
Try now? To the microphone?
Okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
Super. Okay. I'll try and stay here. So if you look at these paintings, you can see that pretty much every angel is holding a musical instrument or a score and singing. And this is just a small selection. The paintings are positively teeming with musical instruments. But for some reason, it's not a topic that's very often explored. And it is a shame, because there's an awful lot we can learn about music, as I hope to show you over the course of this evening. And it's not just religious works, much the same is found in secular works. Here's the Duke of Urbino's study. It's panelled with wood, reflecting the Duke's interests. And we can certainly see that one of his main interests was music. The thing is full of music. So, for example, here we've got musical scores that are open, and you can actually read the notation on these musical scores. You can see musical instruments laid out in the seat. The one, I don't have a pointer, but you see the one on the top right, there's an instrument that looks very like that in your museum here. And then here, these instruments, I mean, they're just astonishing. You know, this range of musical instruments that the Duke owned, splendid trompe-l'oeil instruments. So when we start to look at more closely at this, you can see that just how important music was to this period. And one of the reasons for that is that because music was considered to be one of the 7 liberal arts. The 7 liberal arts are the foundation of higher education, the defining quality of any person who considered themselves to be educated or cultured. And because of that, music was a very important part of education, and that extended in areas that we wouldn't necessarily expect. So, for example, Chaucer describes the knight's young son, the squire. Chaucer says of him, "Well could he sit on horse and fair ride, he could songs make and well indite," that means compose music, "joust and also dance." Then we have another English source, a handbook from around 1471, showing that these skills were very much part of a young man's training. So here we've got, under the heading, "To show the schools of urbanity and nurture of England," we've got the duties of the master who's in charge of the training. Those duties are set out, and they say, "To learn them to ride cleanly and surely, to draw them also to joust, to learn them to wear their harness or their armour, to teach them other learnings virtuous, to harping, to pipe, sing and dance." So those learnings are virtuous: singing and dancing, reading music, playing music. And we find that music is a very important element in every princely European court. Here's the Duke of Burgundy and his son. They both played the harp. Charles also sang and composed music. And in common with other European princes, music surrounded princes wherever they went. Princes, rulers, the nobility across the board. So banquets and balls, tournaments, processions, baptisms, marriages, funerals, all that sort of thing. And some of the sources, some of the records that we have give us a real insight into what was expected of musicians, and at times what they were expected to do could be, to say the least, challenging. So, for example, the Duke of Burgundy gave a very grand feast in 1454, and specifically to delight, the record says, to delight the assembled company, 28 minstrels playing trumpet, bagpipe, crump horn, tambourines, lutes, flutes, and viols were delivered in a pie. Can you imagine being expected to be inside a pie and play your instruments at the same time? But that very much reflects the taste for theatricality at the time. So musicians accompanied princes on their travels, whether they were going to war or whether it was a diplomatic or peaceful mission. Here we have a record from 1475 during one of Charles the Bold's military campaigns. The Milanese ambassador noted, "Even though he," meaning Charles, "is in camp, every night he has something new sung in his quarters, and sometimes his lordship sings. Although he does not have a good voice, he is skilled in music." But what we find really is that the ambassador's comments lack the fact that no self-respecting prince, nobleman of any stature would even consider for a moment traveling without their musicians. They were essential to one's dignity, and they were taken wherever a person of note went. And here we have a wonderful extract from Ludovico Sforza, who was the future Duke of Milan. He found himself in a spot of bother, as we can tell by this letter that he wrote to the Marquis of Mantua. "In our antada to Florence, we lack our shawms and trombones, whom we had planned to take with us. We have put them in prison because they committed a certain offence, and not wishing to free them at present, we ask your lordship to be pleased to lend us yours for this trip, for which we shall be most grateful." So, he had to have musicians. And in fact, so I've covered the nobility up till now, but in fact, this deep regard for music was by no means confined to the elite. Every member of society in Europe was immersed in music. And throughout Europe, every town of any note had a band reflecting how fundamental music was. In England, musicians were known as waits. That name tells us a lot because we find that their original duties were as night watchmen or waitmen. They were employed to patrol the city walls at certain hours. One of their duties was to raise the alarm when danger threatened, for example, something like a fire. And how did they raise the alarm? They played their instruments. They also signaled the principal times of the day, awakened important dignitaries by playing under their window, much like a human alarm clock. In fact, the role of the civic musician, the town musician, evolved. By the 15th century, it was very significant to the extent that they served an apprenticeship. They wore the livery of the city. They were supplied with the livery of the city, and they received a regular salary. That's in addition to the money that they received as gratuities. There's lots of records of musicians receiving gratuities. Town musicians were employed to herald processions, including triumphal entries into cities, of which there were many. I mean, a prince would never visit a city, just come into a city. There'd always have to be a triumphal entry. So we have a record in England, in Coventry, from 1474, when Prince Edward visited the city. Pageants performed in his honour. They were accompanied by, and the record says, the waits of the city of harp, of dulcimer, of small pipes, and of organ playing. Added to that, we find the city's minstrels were a source of deep pride, deep civic pride. So towns demonstrated their affluence by maintaining a well-equipped band, and because most of the performances were outside, wind instruments were favoured. They tended to be a combination, as we can see here, the shawm, trumpet, and cornet. Cornet, a lot of you will know that. Forgive me if I'm repeating things that you already know, but just in case. So the cornet, not to be confused with the modern brass instrument, was said to be extremely difficult to play, calling for advanced musical skills. That in itself demonstrates to us the professional standing of these civic musicians. Then we have the shawm, which is the forerunner of the oboe. Here we can see it played by an angel. And in this painting, yet another example of music as a dominant compositional element in a painting. To the extent that there's so many paintings of heaven that are dominated by music that really one just knows that if there were one thing that people of the past were expecting to find in heaven, it would definitely be lots of music. Look here in Memling's Last Judgment painting, where the faithful are welcomed into heaven by angels playing musical instruments. And interestingly, every single instrument is identifiable. They're painted with such precision that it's possible to identify them. So that leads us to our next point, the fact that artists painted the instruments with such precision, the fact that that's what their patrons expected, because of course artists paint what their patrons expect, reflects the fact that music was such an important and central element in everyday life. Here we have an excerpt from a chronicler associated with the welcoming of Henry V back into London after the Battle of Agincourt. And again, it's all associated with the celebrations are all based around music. So on London Bridge, there was a performance set up, and the chronicler tells us, innumerable boys representing the hierarchy of angels, clad in pure white, their faces glowing with gold, their wings gleaming, and their youthful locks entwined with costly sprays of laurel, who at the king's approach sang together in sweetly sounding chant, accompanied by organs. The next interesting point to consider is the medieval and early modern year, when we considered that thanks to all the feast days associated with the church, the annual working pattern was between 240 and 210 days. So that allows us to appreciate all those opportunities for music, because each of these feast days was celebrated with civic celebrations. And they were certainly wide-ranging. Every guild was dedicated to a saint, and every guild celebrated their own saint's feast day. And of course, that would involve employing the town's minstrels to play on the eve of the day and then the day itself. And there were many, many guilds. And in addition to not just the craft guilds, there was also secular guilds or confraternities. These civic festivities covered a wide range of activities. Jousting, for example, jousting competitions were put on. Towns would hold a jousting competition, and they would issue invitations to other towns to come and take part. So, for example, in Bruges, they held an annual, a very, very prestigious competition called the White Bear Grouse, a very grand competition, and participants from Scotland regularly travelled to Bruges to take part in that. And of course, that meant that, the town musicians were heavily involved in that. Events like these were intended to showcase a town's wealth and a town's status, and organizing them was considered to be a matter of civic honor. So this meant that the town's musicians were kept very, very busy. They played prize giving, celebrating the winners, playing at evening receptions, all that sort of thing. Music was very much part of other areas of life. The church, for example, In addition to a daily mass, there was also singing of masses for the dead, for the soul of the benefactor, who had left money to the church specifically for that purpose. Many guild or confraternity members actually left money to endow a specific feast day of the guild's patron saint, and that was accompanied with musical performances. At the Guildhall in London, for example, the Guildhall Chapel in London, music was regarded, this is according to the Chronicler's report, music was regarded as an ideal method of fostering love, mirthfulness, solace, joy, and gladness between people. And so to this end, guild members all involved enthusiastically in supporting various schemes for the provision of music, including an annual singing competition. So that was very much seen as part of a community spirit, community life. It was seen as a good activity to bring people together. To this end, we had there were many choir schools across Northern Europe, in the Low Countries, for example, and in England, and they were financially maintained by endowments. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about that is that endowments came from a broad cross-section of society. So you maybe have a noble person leaving money, but you'd also have someone like a tailor leaving money for this sort of thing, just giving us this insight into how important music was seen. And in fact, endowments reached such a scale that in some places the scale of musical performances was considerable. For example, in Bruges, in the late 15th century, you could listen to 3 performances of polyphonic music a day. England too supported song schools very much. We'll come to this in greater detail presently, but here's a 15th century report informing parents of their son's progress at one of these English song schools. The report says, "The child is right well heartened into his song, that is to say both plain song and pricked, meaning polyphonic song." And one of the things that's really interesting about this, apart from the fact that, it's just interesting to see how education worked, but one of the things that makes this particularly interesting is that we see that the children that went to these music schools were able to receive the kind of education that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to receive. So they were culturally enriching for the pupils that went there, as well as for the greater population. For example, in Bruges, in the early 1480s, the singing master at the principal church in Bruges, St. Donatian's, he composed school plays for his choir boys to perform. And these plays were dramatizations based on Latin texts like Virgil's Aeneid, as well as morality tales. But that's the kind of education that these children were receiving, who had this musical education. Just they would not have been able to have that kind of education otherwise. Then we have another very interesting development, again in Bruges in 1480. A very wealthy merchant, William Morrill, he was involved in the introduction of regular public performances in concerts in Bruges. These are thought to be the earliest events that legitimately carry that name. They were public concerts, they were to be free, and they were staged in the evening so that working people who were working during the day would be able to attend these concerts. And it turned out they were such a success, that first year they were such a success, that the following year the city magistrates stepped in and increased funding to extend the singing. Now this is what's really remarkable, to extend the singing to every day of the year. On the face of it you think, well, that's very nice, but I mean, when we actually stop and think about what that meant, that was an enormous task for musicians every single day of the year. But even more significant, because it covered the whole year, that meant that many of the performances, the bulk of the performances actually, would have to be held indoors. So for the very first time, it was agreed that city musicians would be allowed to perform in church. Now, that is really something, because that meant that, I mean, the impact that the organizers can't possibly have been aware of the impact that actually had on musical history. Because if the city musicians are playing inside, they're playing the kind of instruments we saw, trumpets, shawms, that sort of thing, but they were designed to be played outside. This is the first time that instruments other than an organ was played inside the church. So of course they couldn't use the same music they'd been using. This called for a whole range of new compositions, new ways of composing music, just a whole change in the way music was composed and delivered. Just an astonishing change. And of course, then that would also lead to a change in the design of musical instruments. It's a fascinating aspect. Now, with all this flurry of activity, we might pause for a moment and ask, how was all this to be paid for? And what laid behind this degree of benevolence? Because this was very, very expensive. You can imagine in Bruges, musicians being playing every day, and that cost a lot of money. So why did the authorities think this was a good idea? Because it was the authorities that were behind it. In fact, we find that this is all associated with the philosophy of the time. They reasoned that public performances of music would be beneficial for every good and devout person. So the whole idea of this is that if we invest money in music and the performance of music and education of music, it'll be a benefit for the greater good. It's a wonderful idea. And in fact, just as an aside, that's exactly the same reasoning lies behind the foundation of the public art galleries across Europe, including the gallery in Edinburgh. The reason that was founded is because it was seen as, for the population to be exposed to great works of art would be beneficial to the common good. So this takes us to another important topic, the influence of English music. Because remarkably, the word Renaissance always conjures up the ideas of Italy, as if Italy were the arbiter of all taste, but in fact music, what we regard as what came to be characterized as Renaissance music, originated not in Italy but in England and to an extent the Netherlands. So features such as vocal and instrumental polyphony, those things develop from plain song, church plain song, and popular melodies. But that is a development that stems from England. The connection between English music and the Angels' concert in this famous altarpiece, the Ghent altarpiece, may seem tenuous, but do bear with me, and I think you'll find it's worthwhile. So breaking it down, here we've got the Angels' concert, and just notice how realistic the depiction is. The keys of the organ are pressed down in a proper consonant chord, and the degree of accuracy is really astonishing. Then we have these angel musicians. We see the tenor, fiddle, and the bow are held correctly. And notice that angel. I wish I had a pointer, but can you just see that angel with a oh, thank you.
So I work at the university, I'm Catholic, so it should.
Oh, perfect. Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. That saves me waving my arms around. Yeah, so you see. No, I don't. Oh, almost. It doesn't seem to come up against the screen. Can you see it? Oh, good, because I have to say I can't see it. Yeah. Thank goodness for that. So you see that angel with her hands doing that. In fact, what that, or him or her, in fact, what that angel's doing is counting the measure of rest with their fingers on the shoulder of the fiddle player. I mean, just really quite astonishing. Then we look at the angels in the choir, and at first glance, I mean, this is an extraordinary looking representation, and our first response is to ask, why on earth do they look like that? They actually look as if they're in pain, especially the two on the right. But once we know a little bit about, this is where knowing a bit about the background, once we know a little bit about the background, everything becomes clear. Because what we've actually got here is these angels are singing in different registers. They're not singing plain song, they're singing in different registers. Some are straining to reach the high notes, the ones that look as if they're in pain. That's Van Eyck is painting them like that to show that they're straining to reach the high notes. And then the ones at the back, you can see they're singing the low notes. So really, in short, this choir of angels is singing polyphony, compositions that contain several melodies that are intended to be performed together rather than plain song. Now, from the painter's point of view, this approach has little pictorial value. I mean, these are deeply technical details, and such technical details would only be of interest to music specialists. But as we see, because the Ghent altarpiece it's on public display in St. Bravo's Cathedral, it was intended to be seen by, hundreds, thousands of people, which it was. So technical details like this are of interest to specialists, but many people were specialists, did have a deep interest in understanding in music. And that leads us on to our connection with English music, because what's really fascinating about this is that polyphonic composition was a musical development that was identified with England. It was known as the English style, and it was deeply admired throughout continental Europe. It's English. English singers who were trained in this new style, in particular the emphasis on the top voice, which carried extreme technical as well as emotional demands. These English musicians were eagerly sought across Europe. The Italian courts vied with each other to attract these famous English singers. Added to that, Van Eyck's painting is rather neat because English music, this type of English music was said to sound angelically sweet. So here we've got Van Eyck indulging in a spot of a wordplay. And as if that weren't enough, we've also got quite possibly a reference to Pope Gregory the Great, the 6th century Pope, his well-known maxim. When he saw a group of English slaves in the market in Rome, they were fair-skinned and fair-haired, and he is said to have remarked, "These are not angles, but angels." So it would appear that Van Eyck is also making a reference there. Here we have another Netherlandish painting, that includes a composition by the English composer Walter Fry, a very well-known composer of his day. And in fact, this painting is meticulously painted. The score's legible, the lyrics are legible, the choir books held by the angels. In this version. And Walter Fry was so popular that several of his compositions have been described as 15th century European chart toppers, which is rather fun. So Walter Fry, one of Walter Fry's patrons was Anne of Exeter, who was the sister of Edward IV, and there was one other sister, and she was Margaret of York. She married the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold. Now, that turned out to be a stroke of tremendous luck. we can see that Walter Frey's music was appreciated in the Netherlands, which really was fortuitous because the following century, Henry VIII's heavies destroyed, well, a lot of English art hardly covers it, and music. There's very, very little art. The main English art and music that we now have is found on the continent, not in the United Kingdom. So this was really a tremendous stroke of luck that Walter Frey's compositions were appreciated here. And we find that the musical instruments are depicted with such accuracy. The composition reflects the way musicians were set out, the way they actually performed. And for this reason, musicologists are eternally grateful to this painter. It's just stuffed with evidence of the period, and without paintings like this, we wouldn't have anything like as much. This is primary source evidence for the performances of music. In Edinburgh too, people could enjoy regular performances of polyphonic music because such performances were were stipulated in the statutes of the newly formed Trinity College. And if we look closely at this, hold on, I'll just go back. So in common with this painting, where we can see the musical notation and the words, they're all legible, much the same can be said of this hymnal. It's open at the first verse of a hymn, O Lux Beata Trinitas. It's a particular hymn that was sung at Saturday Vespers and Trinity Sunday. And this is a nice example of a type of hymnal. Hymnals took many forms. This one is a typical workaday hymnal with plain pages and very large text that in large part was to make them legible to the choir, because we find that choir books were created to be shared amongst choir members. So they were often very large. Some of them were absolutely enormous, 3 feet across. Those choir books were chained to choir stalls, and they must have rested on something. But also the large format must have been very useful for people whose eyesight wasn't as good as it might be. Added to that, Canon Bonkel was known to have acquired an organ for Trinity Chapel, and this the organ in the painting might well be a portrait of that organ. And if that's the case, it's entirely feasible that he included a hymnal with his gift. This is. We can base this on evidence. Most benefactors did include music books with their endowment. So as Bonkel donated the organ, it's quite likely that he donated some hymnals. And if that is the case, then it's quite possible that we're actually looking at a portrait, in inverted commas, of the actual hymnal that Bonkel donated. And there are extant hymnals today that look like this. Just as a bit of an aside, this painting is a wonderful example of the very, very close connections between the Low Countries and the Netherlands and Scotland. The connections between the Netherlands and Scotland were very close. So in this case, Edward Bonkel's brother Alexander lived in Bruges. He had been sent there as a diplomat. He later took citizenship, and he made a good living as a merchant. Now, one of Alexander Bonkel's associates, very close associates, was the aristocratic Anselm Adorn, who was a very interesting man. He was engaged in all sorts of activities. In particular, for our purposes, he was an envoy to the court of James III in Scotland. And he seems to have been on very friendly terms with the king, and he's known to have found a lute teacher in Bruges specifically for the king. The fact that it's a lute is of interest to us because at the time, I know this sounds like a bit of a tangent, this painting by Titian, but this is a good example of the idea that the lute was the instrument of choice for anyone who regarded themselves as noble. Well, of course, the king was noble, but anyone that had aspirations, the lute was the instrument of choice. And Titian, the Venetian artist Titian, cleverly employs that here. Notice he's given the very elegantly dressed chap a lute as opposed to the flute, which was considered to be a pastoral instrument. So, with that very, very quick and brief summary, we now hopefully can think about all these many, I mean, I've shown you a handful of paintings, there's so many more that are available, but we get this idea that looking at all these paintings teeming with references to music, including references that we might assume would be only of interest to specialists, technical details, all precisely painted, so much so that musicologists have been able to identify precisely all the instruments. Read the scores are legible, but the notation and the words all legible, which is just an absolute gift for a musicologist. And incidentally, that's not confined to secular music. Again, here's a painting by Titian, a very, very different painting. But in this painting, Titian includes a sheet of music near that chubby little chap who's blissfully urinating, nobody seems to notice. And the sheet of music, the words and the notation are legible. The sheet of music, it was from a popular song of the time, and the sheet of the song tells us that he who drinks and does not drink again does not know what drinking is. It's very fitting for the painting. But for us thinking about this, you know, in summary of this, knowing the importance of music for the viewers of these paintings, that helps us to understand. Otherwise, we look at the Ghent altarpiece and we think, well, why on earth is it painted like that? Why does it look like that? It gives us a little bit of insight into what the viewers of the time, what did the artist patrons expect to see in their paintings. It also gives us a rather wonderful insight into the cultural life of the time. We just see just how important music was to a contemporary audience. And, as if that weren't enough, just think of all those historians of music that are happily absorbing all these wonderful details. I mean, here we've got, I just couldn't resist this slide. I don't know where this slide comes from, but I wouldn't have been surprised if it came from people that work here. These chaps have actually built this old organ, and here they are, you know, based on the Trinity panel. So I thought we would end with an associated topic to do with music in this period. We saw that how music was one of the main reasons that so much money was given to support music, to support education of music, to putting on all these public performances, free performances, note, they were all free, was because it was considered as being beneficial to the public good. Now, in this period, in the 15th, 16th century, music had another important, there was another important use. And that takes us to the Netherlandish artist, some of you may have come across before, Hugo van der Goes. He's the artist responsible for the Trinity panel. He was a poor soul, a tormented personality, and he suffered bouts of acute depression. One of the brothers in the monastery where he lived remarked that Hugo was deeply troubled by the thought of how he would ever finish the works of art he had to paint. In 1481, He was returning from a trip to Cologne with a party of fellow brothers, and he suffered a total mental breakdown. We've still got an account of the time, and it really does sound quite distressing, to the extent that the brothers had to forcibly restrain Hugo from violently taking his own life. When the travellers sent ahead to their prior, and when the travellers finally reached Brussels, the prior of Hugo's cloister had the treatment ready. So what was the treatment for 15th century remedies for mental collapse? Music therapy. So Hugo was brought back. The prior had arranged for music to be played to him and music to be sung to him. That was considered to be I just think that's marvelous. It'd be nice if that were used today. And in fact, that goes back quite a time. Here's a page from a late 13th century manuscript. If you look closely, I think you do have to look quite closely, but you can see that music was long considered a powerful remedy for overcoming melancholy. So if you see in the margins here, there's a little figure above playing music, and down below there's someone sunk in deep depression, with the implication that the playing of music will help to raise that person out of their depression.